was born in central New York, teaching in Manchester, New Hampshire for the last. Um, Central New York sounds like a problem, but my mom's side of the family is all from Portsmouth, Kittery, York area. So her father's family came here from French Canada about 120 years ago. And then her mother's maiden name is Estes. So her family has been in Portsmouth, Dover, Kittery, York area since the mid 1600s. So she provides me that sliver of legitimacy. I've always been interested in local history. Started with cannonball or bed warmer or bottles in the barn that are from the 17 and 1800s. My dad is always looking for more bottles. He's got the barn is stacked with bottles, and he will not part with any of it. So it's just something that he really likes to dig and look into. So when I moved to the area in the late 1990s, it was Exeter at first, but then in 2005 I moved to Newmarket on the corner of Wildleaf Falls or 152 and Lee Hook Road. A single grave that was supposed to be on my property got me curious, which led me to right here and right now. But it led to the Society's transcription of Sarah Olivia Haley Haines. Her diary from 1862 to 1864 was already done. So I learned that she was a teacher and at the Four Corners School, at the corner of Four Corners, Grant Road, and Ash Swamp. So she was teaching there and boarding with the Haines folks. The Haines folks were at the Crow and Eagle Mill, right there in Pecassac, on the Pecassac River. So then, of course, it rolled into the transcription of Alanson Haines' Civil War letters, which were mostly done. So I was entrusted to complete the other 58 pages. So I just finished that, and I've got his diary. But first, the letters are sent. Bulk of them are to his brother, or to his parents, excuse me. A couple of them are to his brother, and there are even a few to Olivia. So I have, having read her diary, now I'm reading his journal and his response and his thoughts about her. So it's kind of interesting because she becomes his future wife in years to come. Finally, working on Alanson's war diary to transcribe is the next project that I've got. But this came onto my radar screen. So when the Frost collection in this presentation was in its early stages, I look forward to sitting out there where you are right now, but there are other things that were coming into play here. So one of those is the mention of Colonel Frost by Alanson Haines in his letters home. So I was writing these letters, and then we had this presentation on Colonel Frost, and it was sort of like, well, I already know this stuff, so I was going to put it in a couple of slides, but it snowballed. So then I read his diary, found some mentions of Colonel Frost in there, and then his post-war speech also hinged on some things that Colonel Frost had done during the war. So when Jason Stonesifer had already organized the collections and had his PowerPoint presentation done, it was done. I haven't done really any research short of where Alanson C. Haines comes into it, but they asked if anybody wanted to present it. So I agreed to it, and it was just to the other day when I was dry running through this, and John's sitting there, and he's adding things to this presentation. I love it. So don't get me wrong. I absolutely love it that he's like, I'll put it in a slide, and I'll put this in a slide, and just things started coming to his mind, and I was like, okay, put it in a slide. I'll practice this weekend. So, and if it was next week, we would probably be 5 to 10 slides longer. So on that note, if any member of the society or relatives of Colonel Frost want to add anything on the fly, please feel free to mention something or to correct me if I'm incorrect. So I'm not the least offended. So just raise your hand and say what you need to say. So pause to hear any stories are also welcome. So with that, let's get started. Starting off with John L. Frost, old-fashioned Salem sea captain, traveled the globe, traded in coffee and tea, sugar and spices, textile and goods for wealthy Salem merchants. He married Lucy Fry in Salem, January 1812. The first wife, his first wife. So he's 94 years old, so he'll actually surpass George Frost in age.
Does it say he died?
Nah, I know that's a little typo.
Okay.
Yeah, but he did. So George Frost died in 1879. So but we'll hear from John Frost a couple of times. And yeah, it is his first marriage because he has more than one. You're right, it's tricky. Okay. Good. All right, Lucy Frost died September 24th, almost 2 weeks after George Frost was born. So unfortunately, the mortality of the parents, and we're going to find out the kids, are really high at that stage, that time period. But she died 2 weeks after he was born. And after Lucy's death, Captain John Frost remarried Hannah Buffington. So this is his second marriage. I'm saying that because there might be a third. Hannah died shortly after her son John was born. Captain Frost and Hannah's children were Martha, and they were John. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm just drifting away from the microphone. I apologize. Captain Frost remarried at age 82. This is his third marriage. So he does. He marries someone who is half of his age at 41, Nancy Ordeon. So the first bullet says that Nancy was a widow of John Ordeon, who died in 1866. His occupation was farmer. Can anybody read what the cause of death is? It says, yes, it does. It looks a little bit like where on the river. That's what I thought originally. But it is ulcer on the liver. So with 3 children, a 22-year-old daughter without occupation, a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old, it's kind of a marriage that was necessary. Perhaps he needed somebody to do things that he wasn't able to do at age 82. And we haven't heard the last of him, by the way. So children of John and Lucy Frost are Sarah Lowe Frost Hicks, Mary Fry Frost, John Frost, and then finally George Washington Frost. So they were married in Brooklyn, New York on September 14th, 1848. He was going to college in the New York City area. So they had met and married down in Brooklyn. However, they had relatives that were up here in Salem, Massachusetts, and then in Newmarket. So we have George Washington Frost and Isabella Monty Taylor Frost, and they made their home in Newmarket and remained together until his death in June 1879 at the age of 54. And he died of heat stroke or heat exhaustion, heat shock. He died down in Brooklyn. So they had 6 children. William Taylor Frost was their first child. We'll talk about him later. Some of you who have come up, you've looked and you've seen one of the portraits is of William Taylor Frost. So we'll talk about that when we have a slide on him later on. But some of the other children are Anne Lemoyne Frost and Mary Fry Frost, both of them living into the 1900s. And we will look at Mary Frost. She comes into play also in some of the later slides. George Napier Frost, who only lived to really 4 years old, and then Edgar Grinnell Frost and Albert Wilbur Frost. So it says from 1850 to 1868, Isabella and George had 6 children, 3 of whom lived into the early 20th century. Okay, so we have this coat. So it's a photo. It's taken of her at home in Brooklyn, New York, but not long before her husband left for the Civil War. And we'll talk about the Civil War. But first, this photo features a young Isabella in her beloved fur coat. So is there anybody who knows that didn't already know what this coat is made out of? Mink? beaver, sable, chipmunks. Did somebody say chipmunks? It's not far off. We'll find out. Yep. This is the inscription on the back of that picture. Mrs. Frost taken in Brooklyn, and towards the center, Squirrel Cape. So let me go back to that. And how many squirrels did it take? Now this isn't a quiz, but a lot. But she's staring straight at the camera. It's kind of comical in a way, but yeah. All right. So Colonel Frost was no stranger to the ports of Louisiana. Ports of Louisiana are going to come into play in the Civil War portion of this presentation, but it's because Colonel Frost was no stranger to the ports of Louisiana and the South. Prior to enlistment, he traveled on business for the Newmarket Manufacturing Company to Louisiana plantations. It's very instrumental because they will pretty much be deployed to Louisiana, New Orleans area. His last trip was in 1862 when he was accompanied by Timothy M. Joy, acting as an assistant clerk. So Timothy Joy, he attended Newmarket schools and was employed by Newmarket Manufacturing Company at an early age. He was paymaster for 40 years, so 1863 to 1903, until he moved to Minneapolis. While in town, he was elected town treasurer for several years, treasurer and school board member. He, like George Frost, was a faithful member and benefactor of the Congregational Church. So, before we go on, George Frost got the job here in Newmarket when he was on his honeymoon. So he's coming up to visit somebody, Mr. Webster, who was a relative, and he was just on his honeymoon visiting relatives, and he was offered a job. So he took it. This is the Granite Monthly, which was a magazine. It's published in 1906, and it was the Newmarket article, Newmarket on the Lamprey. And they have composites of the community luminaries. And it says, when Mr. Webster retired as an agent in 1855, George unanimously chosen, though his quote-unquote extreme youth, that he was remarkably successful. And we want to keep in mind what's going on in his personal life with this appointment to the Newmarket Manufacturing Company, and how he is successful in his enlistment in the military. So it's the Civil War. So this is where I've got a lot of quotes that happen to come into play. So the first thing is in 1862, George Washington Frost left his prominent position in the Newmarket Manufacturing Company to enlist in the Union Army as a 38-year-old private. So the Granite Monthly happened to say that he enlisted despite his lucrative job. So he went from private to major in how many days? Anybody have any idea on how many days? 5 days. He went from private until into the job of major. And then how many more days was it that he was able to climb into the lieutenant colonel position? An additional 10 days. So 15 days he goes from private into lieutenant colonel. So he does this until his climatic fever in Louisiana forced him out, but we'll go into that with a couple of quotes. A couple of different things. That was an old term. Typhoid, I believe. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's highlighted with a couple of quotes in the letter that John added to this. I'll read that in a second. But again, this is the Civil War. It's the Banks expedition. General Sherman, General Dow, New Orleans, Camp Parapet, Carrollton are all mentioned here. Fort Hudson, where the Newmarket boys actually got into combat. But he is the go-to man for the mail. And I'll get into that in a second as well. So Charles Perkins, Nat Robinson, John Palmer, Freed Dockham, John Hanson, George Taylor, all of them were 9 months men, along with Alanson Haines. And then Alanson just does, he's used to, he basically refers to Frost in his diary and his letters, but before I'm going to talk about those, he gives his speech in his post-Civil War era recollection, and where he says, quote, "Where we were put on board the James S. Green, a small canal boat with an extra deck built on, the boat being so small that Colonel Frost refused to place 2 companies on board and was consequently placed under arrest and sent to New York, where he was soon released and sent back to his command." Just demonstrates his trust, and because he's concerned with the safety of his men, that's why his men respect him so much. Friday, December 6th, the transport from New York, Alanson says, quote unquote, "Colonel Frost was very sick." Probably not seasick because, again, he had already been down in the Louisiana area and they had come off of the train cars and were getting on board a boat, which are going to take them down to that area. Early on, it says, quote, "I must close for now. Colonel Frost is going to take it to the office." And he's talking about the mail. And Alanson's very peculiar about the mail. I don't know how all of the soldiers were, probably some of them to some degree, but Alanson's very peculiar about the mail. He wants to make sure that his parents get his mail, and he wants to make sure that his parents write him daily. So he is very strict about that. But on February 12th, 1863, he says, quote, "Colonel Frost is getting along pretty well," which is strange because 4 days later, he's resigning and going home on account of being sick. Again, I'd say climactic fever. So he also mentions Colonel Frost is with Dr. Toll, who himself is a Newmarket resident of Newmarket, and he's down in New Orleans. So this is going on and on and on, because we have the 25th of February. It says, quote, "Colonel Frost has resigned and is heading home next Saturday. He is going on a sailing vessel," but he's not going, because he's going and then he's not going. So this fever that hits him, it's not something that's going to lay him out. It's not something that he's in bed. It's not something that he's going to be treated. It's not something that he's going home in a matter of a week. We keep getting references to Colonel Frost. So in just over 2 weeks later, in recognition of his leadership abilities and time spent conducting his business in the Deep South prior to the Civil War, the 15th New Hampshire Infantry Regiment promoted George to the rank of lieutenant colonel. So, again, we have the camp parapet, one of the places where they were encamped, and that's at the mouth of the river that's kind of chokes off. So they're hoping to choke off supplies to the south, and that's pretty much where they are. You see the map up in the upper left-hand corner. So this is the letter home written by Alanson Haines from Camp Parapet, Louisiana, April 2nd, 1862. Some of the boys say that we shall start for home in 6 weeks, but I don't think that anyone knows when we shall start except those at headquarters. The colonel told one of the boys in our company that takes care of him that he should start as soon as we could to get transportation, but I don't know how true that story is. I think Colonel wants to get home just as bad as the men do, for he has been sick for some time. So it's been sick for some time. It's like a month and a half. Remember, this is April 2nd, and we first are alerted to him becoming sick in the middle of February. So the question right now is he hanging on because he wants to make sure everything is on the up and up, or is it because of the fact that everybody is sick? I think that the colonel wants to get home just as bad as the men do, for he has been sick for some time. The major is very sick of typhoid fever, and they don't expect that he will live. We have no fields or officers now to command our regiment, but Captain Aldridge of Company A acts as major. I don't think that we shall be called into battle very soon without any officers. We have not got but 4 captains that are fit for duty, and a great many of lieutenants are sick. There's more officers sick than men on average. So again, it's not just Colonel Frost that was sick, it was kind of a pandemic. So the last entry that I had was one from March 12th, and it said the colonel marched up the river about a mile and back. The colonel said this morning to have knapsacks out, all packed and ready at a moment's notice. So it's not just that he's around, it's that he's running them on drills. And this is the chest, which is right over there. You can see it's in excellent shape. On the outside, it looks all beat up and scarred, but on the inside, the planks look like they were plain yesterday. After falling ill, George Frost was honorably discharged from the Union Army in 1863. Future Speaker of the House of Representatives, Major General Nathaniel P. Banks, approved his discharge papers. So that's a copy of his discharge papers. Getting back to Willie, who we have the portrait over there and piece of fabric as well. And this is outlines what that fabric is. George and Isabella's first child, Willie Tiller Frost, passed away in 1857. In addition to the photograph of the young Willie, the Frost family collection includes a lace collar from the image here on the top left, as well as the elementary school primer from 1856. So it's the same collar as he has in that picture a long time ago. All right, so we have a picture of, on the right, of an eel spear. All right, so there are shorter versions of this. This one itself was 10 feet 4 inches long with the eel hook. It looks like a really long rake, but at the end, the prongs are hooked. So the article reads, last Wednesday afternoon, as 3 boys, Edgar Frost, John Watterson, and Herbert Davis, were sliding on a bobsled on the river, the ice gave way, and all 3 were precipitated into the water. The accident occurred near the Yellow Warehouse, and their cries for help speedily brought assistance. In their haste to rescue the lads, 2 or 3 more boys and young men broke through the rotten ice, but finally all were brought to safety to land, the 3 first-named youths being fished out with an eel spear by Harry Chapman. So that's me, obviously, but you can see how long it is. And that was to spear eels, and there are some people among you who know that they have personal experience eating those eels. So I don't have any experience, but doesn't mean I wouldn't try it. So this is an image from the Frost family Newmarket home, which is the home across from the library. In 1878, from a second-floor window, Isabella Frost is watching 2 of her children playing outside. So I looked at this photo and I was like, okay, there she is. She's not in the second-floor window. And I said, that's the only person I can see. So, of course, John, perfectionist that he is, he blew up that photo and he found 4 people. So someone up here, there's Isabella, right there in the second-floor window, like it says. And then there looks to be 2 other people down here, probably not the kids. So this is the wallet that is up here. You wanted to see it. It's embroidered with George W. Frost, 15th Regiment, New Hampshire Volunteers, but in it was something that I basically, when I took on this assignment, it was not really an assignment. It was a box of already organized things from Jason. So I'm looking through this box and I'm saying I don't need to be doing anything here because all of these artifacts are categorized. But I pulled a couple of things out and I looked at the wallet and then I looked inside and I found this. I didn't find it, but I was looking down at the Frost, his casket key. So that was to lock the casket up as it was brought from Brooklyn, New York, up here to Newmarket, where he is currently buried in the Riverside Cemetery. So I'm somebody with weak constitution, so I just immediately saw it and I was like, I can't have this in my house. Something's going to happen to it. So I immediately called John. John laughed at me and then and took the collection. So, but I had it for like 5 minutes. Okay, time to talk a little bit about the Little Boar's Head. And in fact, there is much more about Little Boar's Head and pictures as well than is in this slideshow here. But located near Northampton, New Hampshire, is the Frost family home at Little Boar's Head. So the Frost family home evidently is not there now, but the stone garden, which we'll see in a second, is. On the left is a close-up image of the home's porch. On the right is Mary Frost, and she's standing with a friend outside their Little Boar's Head home in early 1930s. So there's the garden. Prominent feature near Little Boar's Head home. This rock garden is mentioned in some Frost family letters and journals. And that's still there to some degree. This is also here, Mary Frost, who spent her final years at Little Boar's Head home, kept a detailed journal of her gardening activities. So a very important, I think, at an advanced stage to keep track of what you're doing on a daily basis, and she does. So this was in reference to George Treadwell, who we learned about earlier, his relationship with Mary Mammy Frost. So both the same aged, raised in a town and attended the same primary school and church, attended lectures, plays and concerts together, interested in reading and classical music. He was her early beau. She was only guest at his Andover 1878 graduation and heard Oliver Wendell Holmes give the address. He went on to Harvard, became a doctor, and married in Brooklyn. Mary never married. When Mary died in 1939, her niece, Amy Wilson, received Mammy's trunk and diary. She sent a snippet of the diary to George. He responded with his own memories of the Frost family outings and reading clubs in the agent's house. He organized an organ recital in Mary's memory at the Congregational Church here in Newmarket. Some extended family. On the left is Peter G. Taylor. On the right is Isabella Monty Taylor. They are Isabella Frost's parents and George's, obviously, parents, the in-laws. From the left to right are Hertilla S. Taylor, Peter Taylor's older sister, pictured here at the age of 69 in 1863. Helen Frost, George and Isabella's granddaughter, who published several books on dancing and women's sports while serving in physical education department in Columbia University. And George W. Frost, George Frost's uncle and namesake, who served in the Corps of Artillery during the War of 1812. This typed copy of Peter G. Taylor's 1871 will includes a clause instructing his executors to invest $25,000 on behalf of his daughter, Isabella, and her children. So $25,000 in 1871 is a shade over $500,000. So a nice chunk of change. In May 1933, Isabella Frost's niece, Bessie Sprague Gilbert, wrote this recollection of her time spent at Brooklyn, New York church her grandparents, Peter and Isabella, helped to establish. In it, Bessie mentioned a number of prominent clergymen. So as you see each of these letters, they're each written quite differently by different people. So they're writing in cursive, but each person has their own idiosyncrasies. So again, in writing, in transcribing, this is a nightmare. I was like pulling my hair out just trying to transcribe Alanson. So now I'm in a good place. Now I know exactly what he's saying by looking at it. But it took me a couple months to understand, what words he's going to be misspelling and what a little wiggle is, what letter that is in the alphabet. Yeah. What's that? Oh, I know. No, I know. Yeah, I'm an English teacher, middle school teacher in Manchester, and I admit defeat that they don't learn that. So Frost family letters, as you can see, Mrs. Lucy Frost, and you can see how they're different in how they're writing. So a couple of very interesting letters. The first in this 1811 letter home, John Frost, George Frost's father, details his time spent navigating the waters, the Baltic region of Northern Europe, as he attempted to find a favorable port to offload his cargo of coffee and sugar. In 1836, Captain John L. Frost wrote to his friends and family to inform them of the death of his daughter, Mary Fry. So Mary Fry, this is a different Mary Fry than we've seen. This is the Mary Fry that came before the Mary Fry who lived into the 1930s. But Mary Fry, following the sudden onset of undetermined illness, despite the best efforts of her doctors, which included frequent application of leeches, young Mary succumbed to her disease less than 2 weeks after falling ill. She was just 17 years old. Of his family's loss, John wrote, quote, "One consolation we have is that everything that could be done for her was done, and that her purity of heart and conduct in life will secure to her a happy eternity," end quote. A different tone, different mood in this next letter. In 1871 letter, an angry Edward Byrne, who was the second husband of Peter Taylor's daughter-in-law, Laura Taylor Byrne, wrote to his father-in-law, Peter, regarding the living arrangements of Edward's son, Edward Jr., indicating that he, Edward, had provided support for the child and was therefore entitled to custody. Edward was so upset that he referred to his wife, Laura, as a cold-blooded shrew. So this is in 1871. There's a problem with custody, with parents not being good parents, and also the lingering question of, why was this letter kept? I don't know. After a week or two, you patch things up, but this one was tucked away for posterity. All right. On June 27, 1861, John Frost wrote his son George to clarify a clause in John's last will and testament pertaining to an outstanding debt of $3,350, which again, it translates into $81,000 in today's market. And the disposition of certain items, including John's watch and gun collection. So in 1861, John is not even close to dying. He has in place this last will and testament that he continues to amend and correct. And so this is 1861. He dies, I think, 20 years later. In 1906, to her letter to niece Amy Wilson, Mary Fry Frost writes about the travel plans of certain close friends and family, the state of her beloved garden, which has experienced a blight, and her dismay at the number of automobiles that travel past her little boar's head home, covering her windows in dust. That problem is never going to end. It's a Route 1A, so. Written in 1928 in New Brunswick, Canada, this letter from Edgar Frost to his sister Mary at Little Boar's Head details the weather conditions and resulting travel restrictions between Quebec and his final destination in Dalhousie. At conclusion of the letter, Edgar asked Mary to send him some refillable stylographic pens, noting the scarcity of pens and ink at his current location. And the format of Alanson Haines letters was always asking for stamps, paper, things that he needed. Every letter at the end, he always went through a laundry list. So there is a letter printed in the Dover Inquirer, and me being an English teacher kind of made me pull out my hair because there are a lot of typos. But I'll read it anyway. Frost touched Newmarket, and also, I have to mention this, the puns that they put in this, I mean, they're supposed to be funny, but there are so many of them, it's not funny. Frost touched Newmarket as the other, another light in a particularly brilliant, remarkable manner. That is, Colonel George W. Frost, agent of the factories here, presented the town with the streetlights. A bright idea again, and one which will keep the remembrance of his generosity shining before the eyes of the people make him more popular than ever. Yes, we get it. So he did provide the money. It's not from the factory; it's from his own earnings. So he provided lighting for Elm Street. So there's another article in 1893 in the Newmarket Advisor, printed a story describing Elm Street as a land of Eden. And it was written that Isaac Dogue transformed his grounds from an area strewn with uncouth boulders and dotted the hillside to one of green sloping lawns. There were majestic elm, oak, and maple shading the trees. There was a time as this part of town was considered as dreary and remote, a sort of benighted region where lamps were unknown. And to venture here after dark would have been hazardous. So, I mean, it's hazardous, some natural hazards, I guess, some rocks, or you could fall in the river, I don't know. But now there's a spacious sidewalk and lamplight guides away so that there is no pleasanter drive than this route to Packers Falls. So a summation of legacy of George W. Frost. He was the last of the Salem mill agents. He's a faithful employee of the Newmarket Manufacturing Company from 1848 until his death in 1879. He lived in the mill agent's house across from the library for 31 years. He repaired mill number 2 after the fire of 1857. He built mill number 4 of Trap Rock, the last to be built of stone from the local quarries. All the following mills made of brick. Only mill agent to visit the cotton plantations of the South, so that made him instrumental in leading Newmarket men to the same location in the Civil War. Transition shipment of cotton goods from ship to rail after 1855. Cared about the welfare of his employees and men under his command during and after the Civil War. Dedicated family man. Family active in GAR Congregational Church and Oddfellows, and personally generous with and respected by Newmarket citizens. I'll take this point to finish with a quote from the Granite Monthly. He was, quote, greatly revered, end quote, with civic and military honors from, quote, courteous, affable, and endearing, end quote, man upon his death in 1879 in Brooklyn, but he's buried here in Newmarket. Sorry. There we are. Very special thank you to the Frost family descendant Frederick Day, who provided access to the family collection and helped with the transcription. So again, there are items up here that were not in the presentation. So if you didn't get a chance to come up and look, then take this chance. Come up and Washington. Yeah. Any questions you have, you can direct them to me, and I direct them right to other members of the Historical Society. I think so, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they call it Phillips Academy. Like, yeah. Yeah.
The son, Treadwell visited the agent's house all the time. He was very close with him, especially when married. In the letters that you read, they had an organization they called themselves pugs. They had little pug heads that they called that. They had a book reading group. They went on outings. They went to the governor's mansion, Cheswell, village mansion in Newcastle. And they had a picnic in the kitchen. The governor's mansion. They had a variety of outings and presentations are all involved with the church. And he would have the family members quite well and visited from Brooklyn. He went on to school. He graduated from Harvard. He went to medical school in Brooklyn. He stayed in Brooklyn, and he lived there with his wife. She was instrumental in the church that created a choir, that created a variety of things. He would come back to Newmarket, and his sister Flora also was oratory. She taught oratory in Brooklyn.
So this Newmarket is considered Little Brooklyn.
There's a Brooklyn connection there, and I think it all deals with and the other Treadwells had no connection.
Right, no relatives.
Other than through us.
Yeah.
And at the end, with Treadwell, he would come back to town every year to visit the old family estates. He had a camp on Great Bay, and eventually a home in Kittery. And every year he'd come back, he would do a classical concert.
Right.
From the pulpit. Early Photoshop in that when Fred brought it over, if you get up closely, you can actually see it's 3 separate pictures of the mill yard pasted together. And this little walkway here is actually laying on top. And if you look quickly, you can see that it's kind of pasted in there.
Yeah, this doesn't go anywhere.
No, it's not photographed. And you can see the old, like a sluiceway that went here. And this door, take a quick look at this door here, because that is the entrance to the mills, where everybody had to go in at that entrance. And everybody had to leave through that entrance. And there was a lunch break of, is it an hour? Half hour. Everybody leaving that building and coming back to that building, and you would be docked.
They get out and get 5 minutes for lunch on your own before we had to go back in.
And just take a look at these beautiful portraits, because I'm sure they all went on to the Asian house.
I'm not sure. I know they were at my grandmother's house, and she tried to point them out to me often, but as a kid I didn't really care. But now that I have all this stuff, this great material, I'm a lot more interested, and especially since you guys, and I thank you guys for doing all this work. Great job.
I mean, the information that we have, that we're pilfering from you, that we're keeping up in the files, eventually will go up on the website. And it is under control. You brought to us.
Thank you. My grandmother saved everything, and everything funneled down to her. Her sister died, and everything just went to her. And then she only had 2 sons with her father, and my uncle died in the 40s. So now he handed them down to us. So she saved everything. We have another side of the family, Wilson's side, that she saved also. So I'm glad she did.
And this little sampler over here, a quick little thing about this sampler, that was found rolled up in research in a bundle, a little note by what it was, and it's a sampler from Martha Webster Frost. Martha Webster Frost is Colonel Frost's half-sister. Lucy Fry died a couple of weeks after Joy Washington Frost was born. He remarried, Colonel Frost remarried Buffington. And Buffington's sister was John Webster's wife. That was the connection in town. So when George Frost married and came to visit, he was visiting his Buffington was his aunt, his step aunt, and John Webster. So this girl, when her mother died so young, she came to live with the Websters in Newmarket. And she did this sampler, and she put in her stepmother's initials, George J.W.F. when she was 7 years old in 18
Martha?
Martha was supervisor.
Yep.
1969. Then her mother died very shortly after giving birth. Martha herself died after she was married, after giving birth to her second child. And we read these letters, you see that childbirth is a curse. I mean, these women die a lot, very often.
Which of course,
You know what I mean, a lot through a childbirth.
and it's cyclical that families tend to be larger because they don't necessarily die of childbirth, but soon after. So that's why 6 children and altering marriages.
How many family members are buried over there?
George, Isabel, Edgar, Mary, and I think was the little boy. I think the little boy is buried. He's been important with me. I think the Taylor family. There's 2 children buried elsewhere when they were very young. I think they were buried with Isabella's family. And if you go into the cemetery, you go down the main entrance as you're going down the hill. I mean, as you're going into the main entrance towards where the urn is, just before that drive, it's right in the corner. This huge tree.
This is Riverside.
So it was a very influential family for so many years. And even after the colonel died and Isabella moved or married to who was in, they were still involved with Newmarket church group. They were involved with the GAR, the Women's Relief Corps in particular. And Mary Frost in World War I, she gave money to the Women's Relief Corps and for the bond girls. She remained really involved with the town even after she and there's a fun story about one of the brothers. He had he went to Newton, Mass, and he had a little boat shop that he rented boats for people to go up and down the river. I'm not quite sure which river it was, but he happened to be instrumental if you read the newspaper articles at the time. He's on a boat about to go under a bridge and he notices somebody walking over. I thought it was a little odd that this gentleman who was well known to be in this area at this time, he goes up, downriver, and he comes back, he sees him running the other way. So he puts them at a scene of a murder happened in Newton. He was a primary witness to this individual being there with the murder. So,
Was
great
it
reading.
Edgar or Albert?
I've got to go back and look at that. It's one of the boys.
Yeah.
It's the boy who wrote the letter to Secretary Rose. Because he was up in Canada. Because he later writes money for a business.
I'll find it. All right,
Here we go.
Edgar.
Edgar.
He was a prime
Dalhousie University.
What's that?
Would have been at Dalhousie University, which is the big university in Halifax.
He tried his luck at fishing and it didn't quite work out, so then, but he stayed on the line. Obviously, he was on the he had Hunt Boats, I think, for a college, and he was on board as well. Take a look, people, before you leave, because it's quite a kind collection.